Possession, ownership, and property. Three big terms that constantly shape numerous economic and private behaviors. If we haven't overlooked anything, we now host the first special collection on the topic in the world, right here at the splendid library of WU Vienna. My name is Bernadette Kamleitner, and together with my team and a lot of support, we founded this special collection. And today, I'm going to show you why it is worthwhile a physical or digital visit. Let's move inside this library and hear what world-leading experts say about why it's interesting to study this topic area.
About ownership, I feel like it's fundamental to who we are as humans.
From the very youngest age as children, to our lives as adults, as spouses and as neighbors, as employees and as owners. We are always involved in ownership disputes, and ownership conflicts, and ownership arrangements, ownership negotiations all day long.
The main way in our daily life that we experience ownership, psychological ownership, for most of us is self-inhibition. We know there's stuff that's not ours, and we know we shouldn't involve in it. There's spaces we should not go into.
And this is uniquely human. So we see that every culture has property concerns, maybe not individual, maybe family level, maybe group level, but is this uniquely human, or is it something that we share with other animals?
I think it's such a interesting moment in our culture to really think about ownership as we're moving from these kinds of private ownership models of like physical goods to these more access-based kinds of models of digital goods. And, in many cases, people are starting to see ownership as being aversive in some cases. Like, I don't want to own a car, or I don't want to own a home.
I'm an organizational psychologist, and it was out of that context in which the idea was hatched about psychological ownership. But I'm amazed and very elated to see how deep roots it's got in marketing now. And I never dreamed that was going to happen. And it's the same thing with entrepreneurship and creativity and education and healthcare. It's really grabbed a hold of a lot of people in very, very diverse areas.
The lens of ownership is in fact not only broad, but also fascinating. And it gets even more fascinating when taking a deep dive into some of the most fundamental or interesting findings. We are nearly at the collection, but before we go in, let's hear some of those findings.
Biggest ones as a surprise was gender differences in feelings of ownership in modern humans. I had done a study which is published in the Journal of Economic Psychology. And what came up was women had a bigger sense of owning things that they don't own. Like, women were more expensive. Men felt more ownership of public spaces. Like, I feel I own the beach, although I don't. I feel I own the park, although I don't. And then when you look at a word analysis of what is your sense of ownership, the men came up with almost the classic legal definitions of ownership. It's exclusive right, do what I want, no one can control me on this, this idea of private power. The women were saying things like sharing. I show my development with my stuff. My stuff bonds me to people.
If I have to pick one, then I'm really fascinated by Joanne Peck's research that has shown that even simple strategies like merely touching an object can promote psychological ownership and lead to stewardship behavior.
Another area that I find really fascinating is work that you've done on privacy and ownership of our personal information, and how certain personal information we feel more ownership of and other personal information we don't.
Sometimes our need to hold people responsible makes us view them as owners. Let's say a factory makes, or a mining company makes a byproduct, some kind of like residue that they produce. The residue is totally harmless. Maybe it's even good for the plants and animals. It's actually nutritious for them and they thrive. If we ask people, when the mining company leaves, do they own this residue that they produced? People say no. But if we said that the residue is poisoning the animals and trees, now people actually say that they do own it.
Mine was about primates' orientation towards property. So there's a lot of people who think primates must have a sense of ownership because of territoriality, protecting their territories. But what is pretty clear is that they don't punish violations, and most importantly, they don't enforce it. So the way they orient towards things is, when I have control of it, I'll try to prevent others from getting access to this resource. But once I've lost control of it, I'm not going to chase you. And then the other thing that I love, it's a little nugget, which is, if you ask young children whether you can own things when you are sleeping, they say no. And so they also have this sense of like, if you cannot control it, somehow it's not really yours.
I just got done reading, and I'm going to mispronounce her name, Georgia Martinovic, and she's been studying massive migrations of people who were abandoning their own country because of political uphill or famine, and they're running into a very strong resistance, as I've seen here in the States, particularly under when Trump was president, about people basically saying, not in my country. And she attributes it to feeling a sense of psychological ownership for territory, in this particular case, the country.
Maybe it's the issue of detaching. There have been a number of studies of how people respond to disasters. Their home is destroyed by a fire or destroyed by a hurricane or something else that takes it away just like that. And they recover pretty well. People don't depend upon things psychologically as much as we might expect.
All of these insights, and many more, are now bundled in one collection. And it is a collection that deserves digging into, also when trying to solve the big challenges we face as a society.
I don't know. I mean, you could almost ask, is there any issue it doesn't come up in? Because, so in the States, for example, gun ownership, should it be legal or not? Or should there be restrictions? Is always an ownership issue. Of course, all of intellectual property law and data privacy, all of that comes down to a form of ownership. And if you think of body ownership, which you can decide if you want to think that ownership extends to like this film, that this is my hand, is a kind of ownership, then even things like vaccine mandates become ownership issues because I'm being compelled what to do with my body. So I don't know that there's a place that the psychology of ownership does not turn up, actually.
Not too far from you in the world, there is a leader of a big nation who feels as though he is losing power and influence over people in another country. And if it was, my memory is correctly, it was yesterday he used one of those personal pronouns in front of the name of that country, my Ukraine.
So when we're studying psychological ownership about, dirt on the floor or objects in the store, or do I own my company or not, this kind of stuff, there's another scale that's really bigger. It's owning my ethnic group's land. And that's the ownership we'll have a nuclear war about.
The issue of property that's becoming more and more evident is the vastly unequal distribution of property, that there are many, many poor people in the world. And that's because many people are the property owners and extract the rent from that property, and it's impoverishing part of the world. who have never had access to these things.
In my work, I think a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, regarding climate change, and I see a lot of potential of the ownership concept for this important societal effort on these goals, because the work of some researchers has shown that it helps to promote stewardship behavior. It also gives us a really good framework to maybe promote better participation of stakeholders who are working to solve these societal issues. So I think there is enormous potential in that.
So for me, one of the most powerful examples has to do with climate change. It's very hard to get to understand how to get people living in a poor country and with all that they have around them is the forest, not to chop those trees down so they can grow crops there. Like, how can you tell them not to do that? Why should they protect our ability to breathe? But there is a solution, and the solution turns out to be one that's quite powerful through ownership engineering, to making it more valuable for people to leave trees standing than to chop them down. And we do that by treating forest dwellers, for example, in tropical countries, as if they are owners of the clean air services that those trees provide. So you can make it possible through careful ownership design to make trees worth more standing than chopped down.
Ownership contributes to many problems, but the principles of ownership can also be used to provide solutions to these problems. Insights on ownership have been used to encourage COVID vaccinations, the sharing of goods, reintegration, but also environmental protection. The topic certainly deserves its own special collection in a most stunning library. Wherever you are in the world, you can now also make this collection yours. Simply search for Pop Collection WU Vienna, scan the QR code at the end of this video, or come to WU Vienna.
Most valuable possession, probably my legacy. My most valuable possession is how I imagine I will be remembered.
Now paraphrasing, it's not exactly what he said, but my undergraduate mentor had a humongous library. And so people were like, oh, have you read all these books? And it was like, that's silly. You know, obviously I haven't read 60,000 books because the library doesn't represent what you know, but what you want to know, what you need to know.